Everyone. I wanted to talk about grids a little bit today. What is a grid? We've probably all used them. Maybe we haven't thought about them much, but we definitely have a familiarity with them. A grid is a framework or guideline that form the underlying structure of a layout, and it divides it into spatial units that can hold text, images, or negative space. And for multi-page documents, a grid is used frequently. And this because for a multi-page document, you need to maintain emphasis, unity, and balance throughout the pages. So if you open a magazine, book, or newspaper, I want you to ask yourself, how many columns do you see? How are the visual elements organized? And are elements organized on a grid? That's a question to ask. So the pioneer of grid-based design is Joseph Mueller-Brockmann. And he's also been called the pioneer of Swiss graphic design because his strategy was very grid-based. And most of his designs utilized photography, simple graphics, and typography. He used the font Acadens Grotesque very frequently, which was the predecessor to Helvetica. And he published a lot of books, and one of his books called Grid Systems was a visual communication manual for graphic designers, and it really sort of showed graphic designers many different grid-based strategies that they could use for their layout techniques. And Joseph Mueller-Brockmann was kind of interesting because he went to school and studied illustration when he was in his 20s. But after he kind of finished up with his schooling, he realized he wasn't that talented as an illustrator, but what he was talented at was kind of figuring out this strategy for graphic design that would make it easier for designers to communicate efficiently and in an organized way. And see, this is just one example of his work. This is one of his designs. And notice something, if you go from the top of the page where this little element of text here and you scroll all the way down with a line, it lines up perfectly with this tiny little human figure at the bottom. So he used this strategy of placing these grid lines strategically so that he could align elements and make the overall design feel very unified and visually consistent. And he was very prolific. So here's just an example, 48 posters he did for the Zurich Opera House. And, throughout his career, he created hundreds and I don't know, maybe thousands of designs for different organizations and businesses. Before we get too far down the grid road, I wanted to talk a little bit about what's called the golden section or divine proportions. And we'll just think of it in terms of a rectangle. So the golden ratio is a common mathematical ratio found in nature, which can be used to create pleasing, organic-looking compositions in your design projects or artwork. It's also known as the golden mean, the golden section, or the Greek letter phi. And the ratio is 1 to 1.61 or 5/8. And so the idea is you have a rectangle with 5/8 proportions, and then you take, a square. You create one side of the rectangle as a perfect square. And then the width of the inner rectangle that gets created and the length of the inner rectangle equal the width proportionally of the original rectangle. And so the idea is approximately equal to 1.61. The golden ratio can be illustrated using a golden rectangle. And this is a rectangle where if you cut off a square, side length equal to the shortest side of the rectangle that's left will have the same proportions as the original rectangle. So that's the idea. And you can see it kind of used in design, and you can keep dividing up that space, that rectangular space, kind of the example here, to create even more areas for you to place graphical elements. And I can show you how to do this in Illustrator. You can create this golden rectangle and then use it strategically as you keep sort of dividing up that space into rectangles and squares to lay out the information. Just another example. So if you've used a word processing program, you've used a grid. And remember that a grid holds text, images, and negative space. And it never shows in the final or usually, we won't say never, but it usually doesn't show in the final publication. So this is just a basic example of a layout that might be done in Microsoft Word. A manuscript grid, sometimes called a block grid or a single column grid, is the simplest grid structure, and it's mainly a large rectangular area taking up most of the space inside a format. And the primary structure is defined by large text blocks and margins, which position the block within the format. And this is examples of different column grids. So you have a 1-column grid. This might be used for a print magazine. You also have a 2-column grid or a 4-column grid. And when you have many elements to organize, you need to establish an underlying structure that can provide help in maintaining clarity, legibility, balance, and unity. And this is especially true when dealing with a multi-page formula where you need to establish a flow or sense of consistency from one page to another. And you don't have to stay within the little sections. A designer can let text and objects begin at the guideline and then extend as far as needed. And so there's some terminology you should get familiar with. The first terminology is bleed, and a bleed is where elements can go off the page and out of the framework. There's also trim lines. Sometimes these little lines are created at the edge of the document where the cut is going to occur, and this just lets the designer know what's going outside the bleed area. And then you have a gutter jump. A gutter jump is where you have, so imagine this is, it is the inside of the book. So you have 2 pages or a magazine, and that's called the gutter. And then if graphics jump from one side to the other, it's called the gutter jump. And so you kind of see strategically, you can either be really precise and keep information within the lines of the grid, or you can let a graphic flow in and out of those lines. So it's kind of very free. You don't have to be really rigid when you use a grid. It just provides sort of a framework for you to follow. And a column grid is divided into 2 or more columns, and they're usually separated by narrow areas of negative space called alleys. So if you look at a newspaper, for example, if the text just bumped up against the next column, it would look strange. You wouldn't be able to decipher one column from the next. So this little alley is created to create sort of a negative space area so that one column ends, and then there's a space, and then the next column begins, and that's called an alley. So reading gravity, people read from left to right, and your audience will read upper left of page across and then down the page if their language is English or Spanish, for example. And this is also called the Gutenberg rule, and it's used to show how user behavior is known as reading gravity, and it's the Western habit of reading left to right or top to bottom. And you can see in this example, it doesn't follow this reading rule. The reader is sort of forced to start halfway down the page, but in this example, it's following it. The viewer follows from their naturally ingrained reading habit of top to bottom, left to right. So you can break this rule or strategically place information somewhere in the page that's meant to be the first thing they see, and that's okay. So this is a 4-column brochure for Klein bicycles, and you can see that the designer has strategically placed some elements inside of the columns, and then he has let his images, his bicycle, for example, or the picture of the bicycle, sort of go across the page throughout 4 columns and then past the bleed line. In this image, the image is taking up the space of 2 columns, and you can see then 2 columns of text here. And then here you have this little row of the bicycle graphics in the first column. And then you notice that there's this block of text probably taking up the second two columns. So you've got the first column, second, third, and then the fourth column is left with just empty space. And then you notice here, there's like a block of text that's like occupying the space of the side three columns here. So you can kind of have flexibility with that. A lot of times imagery, for example, won't be constrained to one of the columns. It might go into two columns. You can have a text block that occupies the space of all four columns if you want, or three of the columns. So it's really kind of about you deciding as the designer what's going to look the best, but still kind of strategically thinking in terms of alignment and layout. This is a print magazine spread, and you can see the four-column grid, and this makes the design balanced and consistent, which is important in multi-page design, and it really provides flow from one page to the next. So a modular grid is divided both horizontally and vertically into equally divided fields that can be separated by alleys. Remember those alleys, those little spaces. And if you've used a piece of graph paper, you've used a modular grid. A baseline grid is used when you have a considerable amount of text. I'm just going to zoom in because it's hard to see this here. See these little lines? You can barely see them. Basically, the baseline grid is a horizontal guide at regularly spaced intervals that are equal to the point size of your type. It's kind of similar to a ruled notebook, and you can combine a baseline grid with other traditional grids. This example is a baseline grid on top of a modular grid. Zoom out a little bit. In web design, you use something called a hierarchical grid. And that's when you need to organize several types of information that are meant to be viewed separately. And hierarchical grids help users navigate through large amounts of data to quickly locate specific content. And then you have non-traditional grids. So grids do not have to be built of horizontal and vertical lines. In this example, a grid is used creating concentric circles. And so you can see that this is 3 pages, all using the same grid structure, this concentric circle grid structure with the layout sort of really interesting. But then there's this real beautiful visual continuity happening between the 3 pages because there is that non-traditional grid in place. So a grid doesn't have to be apparent, but you do have to carefully plan the layout so that unity is established. A design without unity is usually interesting to look at. So you really have to think, if you are going to use a grid, that helps you establish that unity. If you're not going to use it, the unity still has to be there. And for some designs or publications, the grid is completely abandoned, and that's okay. A good magazine to look at is Emigre. It's not currently printed, but this was a really well-renowned magazine. It broke a lot of the design rules that were sort of established by the Swiss Design School, very experimental, and it sort of had a real sense of typography as an art form. And so it's a great thing to Google. Emigre is a great thing to Google and kind of look up and study the designs. So what if you have sort of a irregular shaped object or image and you want to put it in a grid? What can be really helpful is to create a square bounding box around the object and just kind of make it so that each edge sort of touches the line of the square as best you can. And then that helps you just strategically lay that element into the grid or place it up against the grid lines. So start to analyze and look at different grid-based design and think about what type of grid they're creating. Is it a 4-column grid, a 2-column grid? What's the strategy? Is everything really strategically placed within the grid structure, or are there some elements that sort of go and go throughout the space, occupying 2 columns or 3 columns or 4 columns, or potentially going past the bleed? Is there a gutter jump occurring? Is there a modular grid? So what is happening in the design? Sort of analyze it as you look at it and think about the strategies the designers are using. And when you see something that is, really not grid based, think about, is that the best solution? Would it look better if it were grid based? And how would you take this element and make it grid based? So that's our lecture for today. I will be providing for the book cover project, you are being given a template, but I really encourage you to start thinking in terms of grid-based design. I think, especially with typographic layout, grid-based design can be sort of your savior, your best friend. And so you really want to strategically start to think about it. How many columns? How are you dividing your space? How are you creating the sense of alignment and unity? And that's something that, as a graphic designer, especially using large amounts of type, you're going to have to think about and consider.